There is just one story this morning, the dramatic end of the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union.
She was one of Britain's most high-profile television presenters, at the pinnacle of her career, when she was mercilessly gunned down outside her house in London. Her killer left the scene without a trace. The cold-blooded murder of Jill Dando sent shockwaves through the country. A nation grieved for the golden girl of TV. This was no ordinary crime. This was a crime that shook Britain. On the 26th of April 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot by a single bullet to her head on the doorstep of her home in southwest London. The hunt for the murderer and his motive proved to be one of the largest, most difficult and expensive inquiries ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police. 2 years later, during a controversial court case, local resident Barry George was found guilty for the killing. But during a dramatic retrial, he was cleared of Jill Dando's murder. So who shot one of Britain's most best-loved television personalities? This is the story of the brutal slaying of Jill Dando, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts from those closest to the story. Born in Weston-super-Mare, Jill Dando began her journalism career as a reporter on a local paper, the Western Mercury. Determined to work in broadcasting, she eventually went on to become a presenter for BBC South West. She quickly rose to become a household name when she moved to the BBC's national news operation in London, presenting the breakfast news and 6 o'clock news. But she was best known as the face of the hit shows Holiday and Crime Watch, a series which explored unsolved criminal investigations. Above all, Jill Dando was renowned for her down-to-earth charm that endeared her to millions of viewers.
It didn't matter whether she was doing Crime Watch or the news or the holiday programme and the other things she did. She had a warmth and sincerity about her, which is not really something you can learn. It's just the way you are. And I think Jill had that connection with the public that made them feel like she was their sister or their auntie and part of their family.
Jill Dando was a national figure. She was a very pleasant personality, very easygoing. Funnily enough, she self-deprecatingly once described herself as Miss Blando because she thought she was too nice to be true, but she was. People liked her.
When she moved to Fulham, she lived in the next road to where I live. And we would always bump into each other in the local shops, in the street, and that's how we would chat and catch up.
She was great fun, had a fabulous sense of humour, but very serious and professional when she needed to be, and she was just a great person to be around. Throughout certainly my years on Crime Watch, it was always a very close-knit team, and Jill fitted into that perfectly.
It was another young woman who was going to be the face of Britain at the millennium. So she was the embodiment, in a sense, of the BBC.
As well as enjoying a successful TV career, Jill had recently announced her engagement to gynecologist Dr. Alan Farthing.
She was getting married, she was talking about Alan and the wedding and getting excited about organising everything, and she had so much to look forward to, so much fun, happiness in her life.
I remember bumping into her when she came back from Sydney, when she'd been on holiday, and she was totally in love.
They had met on a blind date and were due to be married in September 1999. Jill talked eagerly about her desire to become a mother. She was happier than she had ever been. Jill Dando had spent the night at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick.
late this evening?
Jill left her fiancé's house in Chiswick. I think it was about 7 or 8 in the morning. The plan was that she would go from the house to, I think she had a fashion shoot at lunchtime, a job she was doing, and then in the afternoon she was planning to go to a fitting for her wedding dress.
Miss Dando had been going to her house purely to get changed. She was no longer living there. She was living with a boyfriend several miles away.
In Gowan Avenue was a 2-storey terraced house, which she was actually selling for about $400,000 at the time.
Jill lived on Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London.
Gowan Avenue is almost a typical inner London suburban street. Terraced houses, most of the people are at work during the day and not too many people around at this time.
But it is an area with a lot of families with children out on the street walking, taking children to the park, taking them to and from school or shopping.
When she bought her home in Fulham and was so thrilled about it, she told me that one of the reasons she'd chosen that home was that it had a hedge and it had a tree that afforded her privacy.
Having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick, Jill made various stops on her way home, including a brief visit to the petrol station, King's Mall shopping centre in Hammersmith, and a fishmonger's on Fulham Road, before making her way home. It was around 11:30 a.m. when Jill finally arrived at Gowan Avenue.
She got out of her car, having parked it, and in fact still had the keys to the car in her hand.
As Jill was about to approach her front door, she was unaware that somebody was closely watching her every movement. The BBC's golden girl Jill Dando was the TV star everybody loved. She was full of excitement at her future plans to marry fiancé Dr. Alan Farthing and start a family. But these plans would never bear fruit. Jill arrived at her home on Gowan Avenue at around 11:30 a.m. As she looked for her house keys in her bag, she was approached from behind.
That morning I was working from home. I was going to go to the Munster Road to get some photocopies done. I walked up and suddenly realised that her car was parked. As I approached her home, I deliberately looked at her front door.
What it seemed to have happened was that Jill Dando had gone to her home address, albeit she wasn't living there anymore, and it would seem that she was attacked and shot effectively on a doorstep just prior to entering her house.
It was a ruthless murder. It wasn't done, the shooting wasn't from a distance, the killer wasn't standing at the gate, he wasn't sort of leaning out of a car, he went right up to her. Pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
There was no time to prepare. From one step to the next, everything changed. Because I was witness to an incredibly violent scene. At first it was difficult in the first few seconds to realise it was actually Jill, and she was actually in that position on her doorstep, leaning against her front door. She had changed colour. There was a lot of blood loss, and instinctively it was clear to me that she was dead.
The gate was firmly closed, and Helen knew it was important not to disturb the crime scene.
I looked around, there was nobody else in the street, and I quickly got my mobile phone to call the emergency services. When I was talking to the emergency services, I said that I thought that she had been stabbed because of the blood loss. It didn't occur to me at that point that it would have been a gun crime. And I added in the conversation, confidentially, it's Jill Dando.
Shocked and distressed, Helen didn't want to be alone.
I remember that I'd seen a neighbour who lives near me. So I ran down the road and knocked on the person's door. My neighbour came to the scene. She took one look and said, "She looks as if she's dead," and ran off further up the road to a doctor's surgery. So I was left on my own again at the scene looking at Jill, who was lifeless on her own doorstep.
The police were first to arrive.
They just went through the gate and started dealing with Jill.
There were mixed reports coming in. There was so much confusion, I think, by everybody because of the nature of the incident and, in reality, the nature of who she was.
They pretty quickly bundled me and the other two, the doctor's receptionist and my neighbour, into Jill's neighbour's home.
Soon after, the paramedics arrived, and then the air ambulance. Jill Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital.
She was certified dead at 1:03 p.m. The BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been murdered outside her London home.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road.
Detectives are now trying to establish a motive for the murder. Our correspondent Fergus Walsh.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
In this country, although there are a lot of shootings, they're usually linked to the underworld, crime gangs, teenage gangs. But a lady like this, shot on a doorstep in a West London street, a nice West London street, very respectable, quite well-heeled, was extraordinary.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it on a very dead hand. Just snuffed out.
Scotland Yard launched into action with Operation Oxborough, the largest criminal investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper.
Regardless of who the victim is, there needs to be a methodical approach to the inquiry. It was just because of the victim, in this case, being such a high-profile celebrity, that everything was increased. For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
Also important to put this in some perspective, because the London police were on the alert searching for the now bomber, David Copeland. And so there was a huge amount of police activity around London and a lot of news media concentration on that issue, because there'd already been two now bombs, one in Brick Lane, one in Brixton, and there was a great deal of concern about where this now bomber was going to strike again and what the reaction would be.
With unprecedented media attention surrounding Metropolitan Police investigations and the victim's high-profile status, the homicide squad were fully aware that they were under immense public scrutiny. They faced their first hurdle with a forensic examination of the crime scene.
Yeah, one of the main problems that the police had was that it had been quite severely compromised by the medical services that had been there, by them removing her body once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, created some problems. Very little was obtained from that scene. What they had done, I can't criticise that, because I assumed that everything was being done to try and save Miss Dando's life at the time.
There was nothing that came out from the scene other than the fact they, of course, had the bullet which had killed Jill Dando, which was quite unusual. It was crimped, it had been pressed in. They used 50 search officers going down the surrounding streets, and they took up the drains, they looked at the sewers, they looked all along the riverbank by the park in case that the government might just have tossed the gun over a hedge or threw it into a drain.
We can't be sure, obviously, about the gun that was used because it's never been recovered. But the thinking was that it was in some way a reactivated gun, or one that had in some way been adapted.
With a serious lack of forensics from the crime scene, the homicide squad turned their attention to examining the witness statements.
There was no eyewitness to the actual offence. Several witnesses gave information about a man who was present at the scene before and immediately after, and one of the main focuses of the inquiry was to identify this person.
Richard, her neighbour, said that he had heard her set her car alarm and that he had heard a scream, looked out of the window, and he'd seen somebody go past further down Gowan Avenue.
He walked very calmly away from the scene, and when I actually saw him, I thought nothing of it. I thought, in fact, it could have been a friend of Jill's when I heard the screaming. That's why I particularly at that moment didn't do anything that now I wish I could have done.
One of the problems that the team was faced with was the unprecedented amount of information that was being received within the incident room. During the course of the inquiry, over 2,000 people were named as being responsible or in some way involved in Miss Dando's murder. Without a clear witness or without a clear motive and reason, stranger murders are by definition the most difficult to investigate.
In a sad twist of fate, Scotland Yard turned to the programme Jill Dando presented before her death, Crime Watch, to help find her killer.
You never imagine in your wildest dreams the idea that you would ever have, or we would ever have had to make an appeal about somebody we knew so well.
Hello? Hiya. Choose one adult.
There was a pressure on us to think that we could do something to help, to use the programme and to use our experience to try and help in some way. And I think everyone was actually really relieved that they could feel they could do something. The appeal itself to find information regarding Jill's killer produced a lot of phone calls.
Several witnesses saw a man in the area earlier in the morning. And then there are various sightings of a man in a sort of waxed jacket. We have somebody who saw what they described as a sweating man at a bus stop. We have another sweating man seen in Fulham Palace Park, or Fulham Park, which is opposite, quite close to Gowan Avenue, who was talking on a mobile phone. So there are lots of different little sort of sightings, but nobody actually saw the attack.
One of the main purposes of the inquiry is to try and separate the potential suspect from other people.
And I think as the months went on, it was quite apparent that this was going to be a long investigation.
As the police persevered with their inquiry, thousands of mourners lined the streets to watch the 3-mile cortege. The funeral service of Jill Dando took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. A grieving nation mounted pressure on Operation Oxborough. Would the homicide squad ever find Jill's killer and bring him to justice?
So, if any of tonight's reconstructions have helped jog your memory...
BBC television presenter Jill Dando was the nation's sweetheart. But in April 1999, she was violently murdered with a single gunshot fired at close range to her head. Her killer fled the scene undetected. What followed was a lengthy and extensive inquiry, but the Metropolitan Police faced a serious lack of evidence. No murder weapon, no motive, and no eyewitness. They were facing mounting pressure from the country's press and public to bring Jill's killer to justice.
What we needed to be sure of, was she followed, wasn't she followed? There was a small and dedicated group of officers that meticulously went through every scrap of footage that we had during the course of the inquiry. What we can categorically say is that from the meticulous examination of the footage from 191 cameras, she wasn't followed at all to that address.
They also searched through 80,000 mobile phone records for the Fulham area and also for Chiswick, which could in some way be linked to her death. Either somebody following her who passed on a message that she was on her way home, or somebody who was waiting and got the message that she was arriving. None of those phone calls produced any evidence either.
The months rolled by, but no significant leads emerged. The police were struggling with a serious lack of evidence.
Her filofax had 486 names in it, and they went through every name and address they could find. They looked at her fiance's background and drew a blank on that.
We obviously just stayed at my house.
I realised that on day one I was probably on a list of potential suspects being first on the scene. That's a normal thing. The nearest and dearest of a victim are always scrutinised, and I knew that I would be too.
Because of the nature of who Miss Dando was and her work, it was hard to ascertain a definitive motive as to why someone would conceivably want to kill her.
Due to constant media attention, there was immense pressure to make an arrest, but they were fast exhausting all their leads. By now, Operation Oxborough decided to change tack. They were beginning to consider the possibility that Jill Dando's killer was a stalker with obsessive tendencies.
Like a lot of celebrities, she'd attracted a lot of unhealthy interest. They found, for example, that one man had tried to acquire her BT account and run it unknown to her, but which would allow him to look at her phone calls or phone numbers. They found that somebody else had 150 pictures on his, of her collected on his computer. Another man had attempted to take over her utility bills, electricity, gas, water. Extraordinary behaviour by some of these people. But the police looked at about 4,000 people, I think it was, of whom about 150 seemed to have what they would describe as an unhealthy interest in her. But at the end of the day, none of these had showed any evidence of taking their interest further than a fantasy or a fixation.
As the investigation reached its first anniversary, detectives decided to re-examine the early information they received soon after the shooting to see if there was anything they missed. Amongst other names, a man who lived half a mile from Jill's house was brought to their attention. Barry Michael George.
George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham Police Station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner. And he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
A detective constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, very close to the scene of the shooting, in which they said that this man Busara had seemed very agitated and they were concerned about him. The policeman did some checking and found that Busara cross-referred to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury, using the alias Barry Bulsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He also took the name Paul Gadd, which was Gary Glitter's real name. He also used the name Steve Powers, who was an SAS soldier who took part in the Iranian embassy siege. And he also used the name Lee Majors, who was a stuntman and Hollywood star at one stage. And he was actually convicted for several offences under some of these aliases, bizarrely. But it's just an example of the sort of fantasy life he led. And for the police at the time that they were looking at him as a strong suspect, that all added to the mix.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further investigations into police records during the early days of their inquiry revealed more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
Detectives decided to place him under surveillance and carefully monitored his every move.
We had access to a whole load of black and white photographs taken of him in the street. My recollection is that those photographs didn't take it anywhere. In other words, yes, he's looking a bit furtive in the street, because he always looks a bit furtive.
The investigation revealed that Barry George had a history of following and photographing women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship, which he hasn't got, with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
Over a year after Jill's murder, and based on their findings, Met Police were confident there was sufficient evidence to arrest Barry George.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
Okay, start the search. I mean, Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. But, so, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things, but I know most people who collect things, maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in the newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out, none of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
Detectives removed various items.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
Police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons, but that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened. And they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made an interesting discovery.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 1/1000th of an inch. It was tiny. But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, was exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material of a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged for the murder. Were Metropolitan Police finally going to get justice for Jill? The murder inquiry into BBC TV presenter Jill Dando's death was fast becoming one of the largest and most expensive police investigations to ever take place in Britain. Operation Oxborough traced, interviewed and eliminated thousands of suspects in the months following Jill's death. A year later, local resident Barry George emerged as a prime suspect. Following closer inspection into his criminal history and police surveillance, they arrested him. It was during a raid on his flat that some of his personal possessions were removed and examined. When forensics revealed a small amount of gunpowder trace in his coat pocket and a thread from his trousers linking him to the crime scene, the homicide squad formally charged Barry George with the murder of Jill Dando.
Barry George's arrest had incited quite a lot of actually adverse publicity, which I think was very, very unfortunate. The public were sympathetic to a very famous, very intelligent, very beautiful woman who'd been killed at her front doorstep. And so there's an outpouring of grief, and therefore anyone who's arrested for that immediately has a problem.
Almost 1 year after his arrest, the trial for the murder of Jill Dando finally took place at the Old Bailey. It was a trial that would captivate the nation and prove to be one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. Barry George pleaded not guilty.
A trial at the Old Bailey for anyone is a pressured event, especially if it's in one of the old courts, which it was, because they've held many famous trials. Certainly most of the UK press and media were there on a daily basis. So the court was full of people interested in the result.
It's a very dramatic trial. He sat throughout it in the dock with a psychiatrist because he was concerned about his ability to follow the case.
He suffered from very, very serious epilepsy, difficulties about concentration and so on. So this made communication a very sensitive area.
During the trial, the prosecution presented George as a lone gunman with stalker tendencies. But his defense counsel painted a different picture.
Was it an assassination?
We tried to present Barry George, obviously as the person that he was, just very vulnerable person, living in the locality, relatively well known in the locality, who had an alibi, which he'd obviously produced to the jury, and basically as somebody who, in a sense, wasn't capable of carrying out this murder.
The case against Barry George centred on forensic findings.
The gun residue was clearly the key issue because it linked, according to the prosecution, it directly linked Barry George to a gun, to the murder.
As far as we were concerned, our experts said that one particle doesn't add up to even a row of beans. It means nothing forensically. We also examined very, very carefully the possibility of contamination at the laboratory, because one particle can be airborne, one particle can go from one surface to another surface, to a hand, to somewhere else. And we examined very carefully whether, in fact, at any time, the particle hadn't been in the pocket but had got into the pocket through a process of contamination. You have to remember, no firearms residue was found in his flat or found in anything else to do with him. So if he's supposed to be adapting weapons or playing around with weapons, where was he doing it? He certainly wasn't doing it in his flat. He didn't own lots of flats all over London. One had to examine the possibility that it had got there through an accident of continuity. In other words, it was contamination.
The prosecution relied heavily on the identification evidence. They relied on a fibre which they found, which they said linked Barry George's trouser to Jill Dando, that the fibre had come off the trousers and onto her clothing.
The case hung on the slenderest thread, that was the sort of comparison, and the slenderest thread was this one particle. Because the identification evidence of him being in the street 2 hours before, in my view, was weak. You know, an identification is reputedly very risky. So what else is there? So the fibres in the case were going nowhere.
George's defence team were putting forward a strong case.
This case depended largely on circumstantial evidence. And plainly, from a prosecution point of view, forensic scientific evidence can be rather more compelling than any other.
It was circumstantial, and they admitted it was circumstantial, but the judge and the prosecution both said that it was possible to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence without, for example, a confession, without an eyewitness who had actually seen a gun used, without the gun itself, without a motive.
The jury retired to deliberate. 5 days later, they had finally reached a verdict.
Foreman of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, my lord.
A jury of 6 women and 5 men found Barry George guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
It was a shock. Obviously for Barry George, but a shock for all of the defence team, and I dare say others in court who had believed, as I had, that this wasn't going to lead to a conviction.
For the majority, it was a simple case of a mentally ill man, or a man who was clearly not in his right senses, infatuated, fantasised, had approached Jill Dando. She had rebuffed him. He had killed her. That's the way it came across in a lot of newspapers and the media generally.
I was very upset, I was very angry, the fact that he'd been convicted. I had plenty of time to think back over the trial and say, well, what's gone wrong here? How did this jury come to that conclusion? I think it's probably a combination of somebody who kind of looked odd in the dock, somebody who looked odd, which fitted the publicity that had gone before. Secondly, I think there was pressure on this jury, feeling that the nature of the crime was so heinous that, you know, here was an odd man and he lived in the area and there was a firearms particle. And they put that together, I think.
Barry George always protested his innocence. But as he started his life sentence, there was unease at the verdict.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George, to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
After an appeal and 8 years in jail, vital new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces.
The Court of Appeal had argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder. There were also points made about the fibre which was found on Jill Dando. The clothing she'd been wearing had been left at the scene for quite a long time after the shooting. So it's perfectly possible for that fibre, which is fairly common, to have come from another source and not from Barry George's trousers.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe. The Court of Appeal set a date for the retrial.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
After 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did. And to give him his due, his persistence, his self-belief, that got him acquitted.
So who did kill Jill Dando?
There wasn't a clear explanation. It wasn't a sex attack, it wasn't a robbery. It was an assassination of some description, and that left people very, very puzzled.
I mean, I believed throughout the case, because of the nature of the evidence and the window of opportunity, it had to have been carried out by a professional.
What we were all conscious of throughout the inquiry was what a senseless crime this was. And the feeling of shock, to a degree, throughout the country never really diminished.
It was just extraordinary, and please God, nothing ever like this happens again.